Hello, everyone. My name is Matthias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm delighted that you'll be joining us today for the first meeting in this semester of our programming on Gaza and the Arab-Israeli conflict, crisis and resolution. The topic for today is, in their words, Palestinian perspectives on fear and hope in Gaza and the West Bank. And before I introduce our speakers for today, let me say a few things about this series, also by way of setting the stage and about some concerns that have been raised in the background. So, first point to make here: so for many people around the world, this conflict is the most visible human rights crisis, and this is why the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy has long done programming around it. The spirit in which we do it is to take the moral complexity of the situation seriously. And I have articulated the stance in an op-ed in the Crimson, the local student newspaper, some month ago, which is easy to find. For that reason, we have been eager to bring in a range of voices: Israelis, Palestinians, academics, journalists, diplomats, other stakeholders, and people with expertise. We are aiming for balanced perspectives, but we do not strive for balance in every single event. Balance should be seen over the duration and also vis-à-vis the overall set of voices present in public debate. The second point is, with the second Trump presidency, there is renewed activity around this conflict. Earlier this week, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was in the White House and held a joint press conference with President Trump. Trump made a new proposal regarding the future of the population of the Gaza area. Now it matters greatly to hear from Palestinians. One of the most basic points about this conflict is that there will never be lasting peace in the region without Palestinian acceptance. For this reason already, it should matter greatly to all of us to get a sense of how Palestinians see the current situation and the prospects for the future. The third point is, we do think very hard about whom to invite to our events, and I definitely do not think our Palestinian interlocutors stand in need of special legitimization. But in a proactive spirit, I would like to comment on one thing. In connection with our event, a selfie of one of our panelists, Muhammad Shehada, has circulated that shows him with Ismail Haniyeh. He took this photo in 2014 when he was a young journalist and Haniyeh was Prime Minister of the Palestinian National Authority and Hamas leader in Gaza. As he explained to me, he took this picture when he saw Haniyeh going for a run on the streets of Gaza, and he posted it to mark how Israel wasn't harming him. More importantly, Mohammed's writings over the last decade in Haaretz and the Forward reveal his openly critical stance on Hamas since long before the October 7th atrocities. His voice is an important one to hear on the current situation and the future of Gaza. With that said, allow me to introduce our three panelists. We are delighted to have with us, first of all, Issa Amro, who is a prominent human rights defender and founding member of a number of nonviolent organizations in Hebron, and who works peacefully against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. His efforts have garnered international recognition, and he has been called the Palestinian Gandhi. His work and also the violence exerted against him, both by Israelis and by Palestinians, has been featured by many news outlets, including the New York Times. In spite of having been detained, tortured, attacked on the streets, evicted from his home and subjected to judicial harassment, he sees nonviolent resistance as the only way to achieve justice and peace for the people of Palestine. He has been the recipient of the 2024 Right Livelihood Award, and this week he has been nominated for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. Aseel Mousa, and maybe our panelists can actually turn the cameras on so that our audience can see you guys at the stage. Aseel Mousa is a Palestinian journalist born and raised in Gaza. After graduating from Al-Azhar University in Gaza in 2020, she worked as a translator and journalist for media agencies in Gaza. In 2022, she began working as a freelancer for international media outlets such as The Guardian, Middle East Eye, and The Intercept. She left the Gaza area about a year ago, continued to do her work first based in Cairo, and is now based in the UK. And then finally, last but of course not least, is Muhammad Shehada, who is currently a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations, their Middle East and North Africa program. He is a writer and human rights activist from the Gaza area. He is currently serving as the Chief of Communications and Programs at the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. He has contributed to a wide range of international publications. In particular, he has written articles for Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper with one of the largest circulations in Israel, and the Forward, an American news media organization for a Jewish American audience. Welcome to all of you. Welcome on our screen. Welcome to the Carr Center. Welcome to Harvard University, to all three of you. Let me start with a generic question for each of you, and I will then first call on Issa and then on Aseel and then Muhammad to have some opening statements on this particular generic question. And that question is, given the current political developments in both the United States and in Palestine, what do you see as the biggest threat to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank? Or conversely, what gives you the most hope for the future of Palestine? Issa, maybe we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you and describe to you what's going on in the West Bank these days. After October 7th, West Bank was divided for pieces, and the Israeli army brutality operation toward Palestinians increased secular violence and attacks. Now, after the ceasefire in Gaza, the Israeli military is conducting raid to Jenin, to Tulkarem, to Kalkilia, and to Nablus, and from time to time to Ramallah, Bethlehem, and Hebron, and other Palestinian cities. Almost every day we suffer from the Israeli military raid. They arrest Palestinians, they attack Palestinians, they dehumanize Palestinians. They close the majority of the checkpoints by political order. So the Israeli military officials said there is no need to close the checkpoints in the West Bank, but Israeli political leaders, and among them is Netanyahu and Smotrich, they said they want to make the Palestinians suffer in the West Bank by closing the checkpoints and delaying the Palestinians at the checkpoints. So in West Bank, it's almost impossible now to move from one city to another. So to leave Hebron is almost impossible. Where I live in H2 in Hebron, it's restricted area. We are not able to leave our houses today. All the checkpoints are closed, so you can't get out and you can't get in. In the same time, no visitors are allowed, no services. I mean, services as electricians, plumber, ambulance to the families, and no social life. And these days, the Palestinians in the West Bank suffer from settler violence and pogroms. The group of settlers, they attack Palestinian villages, they attack Palestinian towns almost daily. They burn houses, they attack schools, they have guns, and they terrify Palestinians, and they are making the life almost impossible for everybody in Area C. Area C, it's the area which is under the Israeli military control and the civilian controls of the Israeli military civil administration. In the same time, house demolition increased maybe 5 times more than normal, which means that Israeli military is destroying Palestinian structures, Palestinian houses, all over West Bank, and it's for the first time since very long time they demolish houses in Area B, because the Palestinian land is divided to A, B, C. Area B, it's under the Palestinian Authority civil control. So the responsible about building is the Palestinian Authority, which is a violation to the Oslo agreement, and it means Israel is, not doing its responsibility about implementing the agreement. Much more land confiscation, Palestinian land confiscation, building more and more settlements, much more than usual. So the Palestinians in the West Bank, they really suffer from very hard, miserable life because of the Israeli military and the Israeli settlers and the Israeli government, and we don't have any protection force. We don't feel safe in our house. Me personally, I don't feel safe in my house. All my neighbors, the same. We don't have a social life, so no visitors at all. Only the people who are living in certain areas are allowed to come. and you are not allowed to practice your identity. I can't have a Palestinian flag on my house. I can't wear a T-shirt with the word freedom, no Palestine at all in my clothes. So they force us to hide our Palestinian identity. And what you hear around you is Israeli music, Israeli flags everywhere. So they are moving, the situation and the identity of the land, miserable life for Palestinians, and impose a different culture on us. So this is the situation now in the West Bank, and West Bank is under the Palestinian Authority control. The Palestinian Authority is talking about two-state solution. They want peace. They talk about peace, and but in spite of that, the Palestinians who are living under the Palestinian Authority, they suffer a lot from the Israeli military raid and torture and detention, and they just catch you in a random checkpoint and they beat you up for hours and they let you go. And it's not one or two, many people like that. This morning, 3 Palestinians were injured after being beaten by the Israeli military without any excuse or without any reason. This is the situation now on the ground. We, as the nonviolence activist and human rights defender, we are, our voices are restricted. We rarely meet media. 2 days ago, the Israeli military deported a French human rights defender who came to document the human rights violations in Hebron. She was arrested and deported without any even accusation. So they tried to hide to hide us and to shut off our voices, and they punish the Palestinians who speak to media, to Arabic media, or to international media. So you rarely see, or if you find someone who's ready to speak because of the censorship in our voices, and you are not allowed to film. We used to film the soldiers' human rights violation or the settlers' human rights violations. Now, if you film, you will be the target for the soldiers and the settlers. Palestinian journalists, many journalists are in Israeli jails from West Bank, and many Palestinians were arrested, ill-treated for filming. I have 2 journalist friends 3 days ago were detained, beaten by Israeli soldiers, and they confiscated their equipment, the cameras and the tripods, without any legal background, even without giving papers for the confiscation. Soldiers by themselves, they do whatever they want. I can say that the Israeli military in the West Bank, because I live it, I can say about that, they are acting as a militia. They don't follow even the Israeli military instructions. This is how we see it in the West Bank, but we try to document the human rights violations. We try to increase awareness about what's going on. We try to empower the Palestinian society to stay and remain firm in the land. We try to help the Palestinian families to find food, because for the first time, the majority of the families in the West Bank, and like Muhammad can talk about Gaza, they don't have any income, and it's a kind of starvation. They are using the starvation as a tool to force Palestinians leave their homes and their towns and their cities to go and to do some kind of immigration outside Palestine.
Thank you, Issa. I'll have more questions for you later. Let's bring Aseel in at this stage.
Hi, Matthias. Actually, the situation in Gaza City or in the Gaza Strip is very hard at the moment. Actually, after 16 months of genocide and starvation, the Palestinian people had hoped that the rebuilding of Gaza would finally begin. But then came Trump's recent statements, bringing a wave of fear and uncertainty. The people of Gaza are deeply worried. Many are starting to believe that reconstruction may never happen. And if Gaza cannot be rebuilt, then how can life continue there? Actually, the people who were displaced in the south and began to go back to the north, to the rubble of their houses, they actually found the life there impossible, even though they saw everything via their social media or via the news, but the situation in reality is harder. But let's be clear, for Trump's statements, I think this is not a new plan. Israel expansionist ambitions date back decades. 50 years ago, Israeli newspapers were already discussing the forced displacement of Gaza's residents during the time of Golda Meir and Ben-Gurion. This has always been part of Israel's vision, because to this day, Israel has never officially defined its borders. For any country to exist, it must have clear borders and a constitution. Yet, Israel remains the only state in the world without either. It continues to expand, ignoring international law and defining global norms. Take UN Resolution 242, which explicitly called for Israel to withdraw from all territories occupied after the 1967 war. Where's that resolution now? Israel hasn't left the West Bank, and in fact, we now see over 1 million Israeli settlers there, with settlements continuing to expand, despite the international community refusing to recognize their legitimacy, even in Jerusalem. And the occupation doesn't stop in Palestine. Just last month, Israel seized more than 350 square kilometers of land in Syria, which is an area larger than the Gaza Strip. It still occupies towns in southern Lebanon. So I think the question now, where will Israel's borders end if the genocide didn't stop Israel and from its expansion in Palestine, what will do?
Thank you, Aseel. Mohammed, over to you.
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks so much for having us. I think that it's most necessary to start by saying that I'm not here to score points or engage in a blame game. I understand this topic is emotionally traumatizing for a lot of people, so I would defer to expertise and authority. And the expertise on this topic is crystal clear. Number one, on October 7th, a number of atrocities were committed by Hamas and other armed groups, and in Gaza's hooligans and riffraff. That is documented by the United Nations, Amnesty, Human Rights and Watch, and others. I think the most respected Israeli authority on this is Amira Hass, a journalist that spent her entire life documenting and chronicling the pain and death in Gaza in Haaretz. And she said, I looked into it, I verified atrocities were committed. But what that tells me is that the pressure on Gaza must have been monstrous to enable such a monstrous attack. And that's number two. Gaza has been under blockade for 2 decades, and the International Court of Justice ruled an advisory opinion recently that it's illegally occupied by Israel. Number three, the International Criminal Court has charged both Israel and Hamas with a number of crimes and crimes against humanity, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and Mohammed Deif. And number four, the war in Gaza is like nothing I've ever seen in my entire life. It's not a conventional war whatsoever. I've lived through 3 Israeli wars, 10 military operations, and 2 grand invasions. None of them come close to this one in any way whatsoever in terms of magnitude, scale, and severity and atrociousness. The first couple of questions I asked everyone in Gaza, and people in Gaza ask each other, is usually, is your home still standing? And virtually every single person I know had their homes bombed, burned down, razed, or damaged beyond the ability to sustain human life ever again. The second question is, how many relatives did you lose? And the answer is always in the dozens. I stopped counting how many relatives I personally lost in February 2024 when it reached to over 34. I couldn't cope anymore. But every time I open social media, there are always new pictures of friends, family, and colleagues in gray color that have been relegated to the past tense from is to was. And it opens your wounds anew every single time. Now, in terms of the risks and opportunities, I'll try to be very brief. I'm aware of the time that we have left. So I would say the first risk is the status quo in general. It's unlivable. There's no need to emphasize this more. If you even cite someone as Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's far-right finance minister, he says Gaza has been a ghetto for the last 75 years. Trump's recent statements that Gaza is hell on earth are self-explanatory. There's the other damaging thing about this unlivable status quo where you don't have an economy, where people are futureless and caged in a permanent state of non-life without present, past, or future, is basically the despair and desperation it leads to hatred. I don't think it's in the interest of anyone that wants de-radicalization or stability in the region to block Palestinians and Israelis in a vicious cycle of hatred and mutual dehumanization. The other thing that I think is very damaging is intra-Palestinian disunity. It's one of the worst catastrophes that Palestinians have suffered, is the inability, often with international pressure and veto, to reconcile the Palestinians in the Gaza and the West Bank. The separation between the two means the inability to articulate a common vision, a common strategy, and struggle together for peace, justice, and freedom. There's also the major threat of the lack of representative, elected, and accountable Palestinian leadership. When you don't have electoral accountability, there's no connection anymore between the leadership and the public. They don't need to care what people think anymore, and that needs to be restored. There's also the threat of the lack of strategy, but also the restrictions on Palestinians' ability to articulate a strategy. So we are confined in repeating peace process, two-state, peace process, two-state. But what do you do when every single Israeli Zionist political group in the Knesset has either voted against or abstained from a vote for Palestinian statehood? They passed 2 resolutions consecutively in the Knesset last year, one that bans unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood, another that opposes Palestinian statehood altogether under any circumstances, including negotiations. The first passed, I think, with 99 votes out of 120. The second, it was 69 or 68. Only 9 members of Knesset voted for a Palestinian state. Those were the Arab members and communist Jewish Israeli member of Knesset, Ofer Kasef. When you are stuck in this paradigm that repeating two-state peace process is met with a team on the other side that says, no way, this is not going to happen, it constrains you from articulating a strategy. But nonetheless, Palestinians have an immense need to articulate a position on what they see the common future with Israelis on this land, and how do they strive to peace, justice, and equality and freedom. Is it 1 state, 2 state, 3 states, confederacy, fried chicken, whatever it is? The other threat is basically the looming threats in Gaza that Aseel and Issa elaborated eloquently, the threat of resuming the war that the ICJ has considered as a plausible genocide, that Amnesty International has called a genocide, and Human Rights Watch said genocidal acts were committed. Resuming the war should never be on the horizon again, which everyone should work to continue and cement the ceasefire and release all the hostages. The other thing is the prospect of settlements. I told this to people from President Trump's orbit that I met recently. I said it would be the biggest gift to Hamas if Israel were to build a single settlement in Gaza. Hamas has sustained a long-term insurgency fueled mainly by the perception of an existential threat amongst Palestinians, that Hamas tells people, if we are gone, Israel will take over Gaza, stay there, no one is going to get them out. Now, with President Trump saying the US will take over Gaza, you can only imagine what credence this lends to elements that you're trying to sideline and marginalize, that you consider dangerous or extremist. Once you have the first Israeli settler walking into Gaza, it would no longer be there would no longer be any pretense for Israel to claim a war of self-defense, even if that war is disproportionate or hostile or indiscriminate or whatever description was assigned to it by the Biden presidency. But as soon as you have a settler, it's a whole new paradigm. The other thing, the last threat, is the threat of ethnic cleansing in Gaza, whether by force, coercion, or what is referred to as voluntary migration. Voluntary in the sense of you have an option to stay in Gaza and poison your kids by the contaminated water that they have to drink to survive and the contaminated food they have to eat to survive. And you have to have a non-life, a futureless life for your kids and yourself, or leave. I don't think this is voluntary by any standard, but that perspective of Gazans being kicked out of their homeland, of the territory they've inhabited continuously for hundreds of years, it would be the biggest gift to extremists that want to destabilize the region. In terms of opportunities, I would say we have three that are very important. Number one is the momentum of the moment. The amount of solidarity that we've seen with the people in Gaza, not with Hamas, but with the people in Gaza themselves, with their suffering and pain that we've seen across the United States is deeply inspiring. There's also the immense energy and passion, people fervently wanting to do something to help. And we saw that with about, I think, $2.1 billion in US aid to Gaza throughout the war, in addition to aid that came from other countries and pressure to increase it. That was immensely heartening. But there's also the most important one in terms of opportunity is people being fed up with this, people not wanting to maintain the status quo, whether people on the street, whether Palestinians, Israelis, as well as decision makers. I happen to agree with people that make common sense points. And two of the people that I would otherwise disagree with a lot, that I agree with on this issue, number one is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission. I'm not sure she's very popular amongst Palestinians for a whole number of reasons, but she said this is our last chance. If we do not achieve a two-state solution at this particular moment, it will never be possible again. And I agree with that. Once you have the hatred, the dehumanization settled in and cemented, it's very hard to wipe it off people's hearts and minds and try to speak about a paradigm change 10 years from now if we don't catch the opportunity now and seize on the momentum. The other thing is an Israeli far-right member of Knesset called Almog Cohen. He said the Iron Dome in Israel has been one of its worst curses because it allowed Israel to coexist with a situation that is inherently destabilizing. I don't think he's pro-Palestinian in any way, but he was trying to make a point that you should not manage the conflict, you should solve the conflict. From his perspective, solving means kicking Palestinians out, destroying Gaza, but I agree that the conflict should not be managed anymore. It's been one of the worst curses for Palestinians, this emphasis on containment and pacification. Like after every war, I've lived through this repeatedly. I've seen it happen every time. After every war, we have these non-stop delegations coming to Gaza, taking selfies with the rubble, taking selfies with impoverished kids on the street, crying tears, bringing in aid to contain, to pacify, to give us a sense, look, you have food on the table. Just keep quiet. As long as you keep calm, you will continue to have that aid. And that has been a curse because it pacified instead of solving, and we need to solve it. There's the threat. There's now the opportunity of a Saudi Arab vision plan, the International Alliance for the Two-State Solution that is offering the most generous proposal that can be put on the table for Israel. Normalization with 56 Muslim countries, with every single Muslim country in the world, including Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, and others, and every single Arab country in return for the two-state solution, in return for ending the occupation. But if we don't seize on this, we will lose the momentum. We've lost it after every war before, and that's something that I'm extremely worried about, is being pushed into complete irrelevancy. Gaza being forgotten again until violence surges one more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me bring Issa back in. Issa, so you are well known for your commitment to nonviolent resistance to challenge Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and you have been broadly recognized for that. Given the current situation that we have now been hearing about, how effective do you think is this strategy? How do you assess the current state of effectiveness of nonviolent resistance, Issa?
First, I want to say that Israel is not defending itself. Israel is too strong to be defeated. In the contrary, the Palestinians are facing existential threat, and we are almost stateless, and we don't have basic rights, and Israel is defending its occupation, its apartheid, and its illegal settlements according to the international law. About non-violence resistance, according to the Israeli military law, is illegal. It's not allowed. So me personally, I'm practicing non-violence resistance. It's not only me, many other Palestinians. Historically, they were organizing campaigns, organizing direct actions all over Palestine. And we have many non-violence leaders in the past, from the 60s, 70s, the 80s, and even the first Intifada. And then the 90s, where non-violence resistance were used. And in Jerusalem, it was used against the Israeli metal detector in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they won their non-violence resistance, praying in the streets and not getting into the mosque and refusing the metal detectors. Gaza right of return marches, the thousands of Palestinian activists, they sat in near the Israeli borders, and they sat in near the fence, and many of them were killed by the Israeli snipers. So non-violence resistance is not allowed, and Israel doesn't want any kind of resistance. So non-violence resistance is there. We have many Palestinian non-violence leaders, and we say it all the time now: existence is resistance. I say all the time, active existence is resistance. So to a Palestinian family to live in Area C, for example, in Susia, facing transfer, facing sitter violence, facing military ill-treatment and military aggression every day. In the other hand, they don't have enough services in the house. They don't have social life. They don't have, they don't feel safe, because the policy, the Israeli policy, they don't evict you physically from your house, but they make it impossible for you to stay. How they make it impossible for you to stay? You don't feel safe because of the Israeli military violence, aggression, torture, targeting you, and the Israeli settlers, aggression, who cooperate with the Israeli military, and they work together to make certain areas unlivable. You can't live in that areas. So Palestinians are creative. So they managed to find a way to using peaceful and non-violence resistance to remain, to support the Palestinian, we call it steadfastness, that sumud we call it in Arabic, to stay and remain, because remaining means for us, it's keeping the Palestinian identity of this land, because the families are using themselves as shields in their land, in their homes, to be, in a way or another, part of the Palestinian resistance. I see more opportunities for Palestinian non-violence resistance, but the main obstacle for Palestinian non-violence resistance is that it's not legal according to the Israeli military law, and they target you. Me personally, I was tortured, sexually assaulted, kidnapped by the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli settlers on October 7th. The first thing they did in my neighborhood was to kidnap me and torture me because of my non-violence philosophy, and many other Palestinian non-violence resistance were killed, were tortured, were dehumanized, were targeted, blacklisted. Second, we don't have enough international support and protection. So many countries, they talk about non-violence resistance, but are they ready to punish Israel and make it accountable according to the international law for targeting Palestinian human rights defenders? For sure, no. Israel has impunity even when they target Palestinian human rights defenders. Third, the infamous Palestinian Authority and their corruption and their division, that we don't have real parties who are really pushing for it, and for many reasons. And usually non-violence resistance needs external support, and it needs recognition from the international community. This is what happened in India, this is what happened in South Africa, but nowadays the non-violence resistance in the West Bank, it's the one which is hidden, and the media is not concentrating on how the people in South Mount Hebron are facing the settlers, facing the Israeli military in a perfect way and peaceful way and in a non-violence way. In Bethlehem, near in near Jerusalem, near Ramallah, near Nablus, Burin, and that area, Turmus Ayyaz, families are doing an amazing campaigns to really make a huge difference on the ground. But we are waiting solidarity groups, we are waiting more support, more recognition from many countries. We have many now solidarity groups outside Palestine, but they are from the civil society and they do well, and we are very proud of them, and they are the ones who are raising our voices. But we want an official support, we want an official recognition to say that Palestinians have the right to peacefully resist the Israeli occupation and to address it as occupation, not to make Palestinians pay the price even for the Israeli war and genocide on Gaza or on the West Bank. The punishment is on the victims to transfer them. After the Ibrahim Mosque massacre in 1994, the punishment was to close the mosque, to close the area, to close the streets in Hebron. We are always the victims, and we are punished as the victims because of the double standards and because of the biased, blind support to the Israeli government and to the Israeli military.
Thank you, Issa. Let me bring Aseel back in. Aseel, you lived in Gaza for much of the current war. You left in March last year, I think. Can you share a little bit with us about your personal professional experience being a journalist, working there, especially as a woman journalist, and also maybe what stories, when you look at the media coverage, especially also in the United States, what stories from Gaza are not being told in the mainstream media?
Actually, as a Palestinian who survived the war and as a journalist who covered it firsthand, I can say without hesitation that this has been the most difficult experience of my life. Every moment was filled with unimaginable hardship, covering the Israeli crimes against Palestinians in Gaza while being subjected to the same suffering myself was physically and emotionally exhausting. I was forcibly displaced from my home in Tel El Hawa neighborhood in the western part of the Gaza Strip on 13th of October 2023. Me and my family were forced to move to Al Maghazi refugee camp in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And there we spent around 3 months, and then we were also forcibly displaced to another area, which is Rafah city, in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And even in these so-called safe zones, there was no security. Me and my family and all the displaced people there, and even the residents in those areas, suffered from the relentless bombardment, killing, the shortage of food and water, and we also lack the most basic necessities, electricity, communication, and transportation. And also, I lost many of my beloved ones, including my cousins, Dr. Muhammad Abu Ghazza and Dr. Jabir Juda. And I also lost my dear colleague, Mahmoud al-Naouq, who was killed along with his family in Deir al-Balah neighborhood, which was classified as a safe area in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And actually, I wasn't alone in this suffering. The war has taken the lives of more than 200 journalists. The number is huge. Sorry. Okay. The occupation deliberately targeted journalists while also blocking international journalists from entering Gaza, making our responsibility as Palestinian journalists even heavier. Each of us lost his home or beloved ones, or even many journalists were injured. Like all my colleagues, I struggled to move from one place to another. With the fuel supplies cut off, transportation became impossible. So I was forced to walk for miles just to cover stories, write reports, and document the suffering of my people. Actually, I can say the hardest part was simply getting access to the internet. communication wasn't good at that time, and there were days when I could connect for only a few minutes a day, and I experienced complete blackout for weeks during the genocide. For the stories that I see the media didn't cover well, I think every single person of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza has a story to tell, or even dozens, perhaps even hundreds of stories of survival, loss, and unimaginable suffering. Each story is a testimony to the reality of this genocide. That's why I strongly believe we must urgently document as many personal experiences as possible. I think we need to listen to every child, every woman, and I think their voices must be heard. Their pain mustn't be erased. I think among all the stories, there's one that I believe demands the world's attention today. I think the story of the missing people, what happened to them, where they killed, and their bodies disposed of, were they arrested, where are they, what did the Israeli occupation do to them? These are the questions that haunt families every single day. Mothers, fathers, children. I think all of these people waiting for answers that may never come. So I think the story of the missing people should take like attention from the whole world. Thank you.
Aseel, there's actually a question directly to you from the audience. Let me just pass this on to you directly. What are things looking like on the ground in your area when it comes to recovery efforts and people trying to reestablish themselves? Maybe you could speak to that for a moment.
Sorry, could you please say again?
What do things look like in your area when it comes to recovery efforts and people trying to reestablish themselves?
Actually, the people who I'm from Gaza City, and the western part of the Gaza Strip. So when I listen stories from my friends or my extended family who were displaced to the south and now trying to go back to the north, they are actually struggling to survive. There's no water. They are trying to get rid of the rubble of their houses so they can build their tents. And as we all know, Israel prevents the access of the tents or caravans. So people nowadays cannot even find a place to put their tents. And if they have it, some people don't have even tents to live in. And also the transportation are still very bad, and they can't move from place to another. And also for the safety, I think Gaza City is not safe at all at the moment, because since the declaration of the ceasefire, more than 30 Palestinians have been killed. I'm not sure if the number increased or not. And 2 cars have been bombed while trying to go back to the north of the Gaza Strip. Surviving after the war is really hard for the Palestinians who are there at the moment. And also the threats of Trump and these statements that they will take over Gaza and they will transfer to Palestinians is something that haunting every Palestinian in the Gaza Strip. And thank you.
Thank you. Let me go back to you, Muhammad. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the question of how you see international law and human rights frameworks being leveraged in this situation. So when it comes to Palestinian rights in recent years, have these frameworks succeeded in any noticeable way? Have they largely failed? How do you see the potential here?
I would say it failed largely at implementing a solution. We have a Guinness record of UN resolutions on Palestinian rights, the Palestinian right to self-determination, for example, regular calls periodically, annually to end the occupation. From the UN General Assembly, we have UN Security Council resolutions, ICJ, ICC, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, every single major human rights organization, as well as a lot of phenomenal Israeli leading human rights organizations, B'Tselem, Breaking the Silence, Physicians for Human Rights, Gisha, Hamukid, and others. So you have this mountain of evidence that speaks to your advantage. The problem is implementation, the lack of willingness, whether in Europe or the United States, to implement these. Also, the deliberate ignoring of this topic, sweeping it under the carpet instead of paying any attention to it. I recently met with a top European Union leader in July last year. And one of the first things he said, because it was a closed door meeting, so he was at liberty to speak up his mind, he said as soon as he took his position a few years before, he was told explicitly by all his directors, advisors, the entire bureaucratic machinery under him, to ignore this topic, to look elsewhere. They said, you will burn a lot of political capital, you will not get much done, you will not get any progress. So don't bother, look elsewhere. People are there, but they're okay, they're alive, they're not getting killed. Things are not perfect, but it's okay, just don't bother looking at this. And he said he complied until October 7th happened, and then you had the international community waking up to the disaster that's been growing for so many years with these atrocities taking place. The other thing is that I would say that human rights mechanisms and international law, it did work to some extent to stop things from getting worse. Early on in the war, you remember when Yoav Gallant made the statement, no food, no water, no electricity, no fuel to Gaza. And that lasted for a couple of weeks, I think, until there was global pressure, global outcry on a popular level and a government level, until Israel allowed Egypt to open up its border crossing, the Rafah border crossing, on the condition that each truck going to Gaza through Egypt should be inspected first in Israel and then back to Rafah and then into Gaza. It helped in other ways as well. It allowed fuel to go to hospitals. It allowed the telecommunication equipment in Gaza to remain intact to a rudimentary level. At some point, you remember, Israel was just decided to cut internet and telecommunication signals in Gaza abruptly, and then they connected it a few days later because of the pressure that was being exerted on them. And it acted as a deterrent to some extent. It was not perfect, but it did help. I would say it should be leveraged more moving on to bring an end to this very, very ugly conflict. My compass with this Israeli-Palestinian topic is not usually one state, two states, or who's right or who's wrong, but it's what can I do to prevent more of my loved ones getting killed and to give my loved ones, the people I care about, and the people on the other side, the best life possible under the circumstances, just a normal, dignified life. So I think if we can leverage that mountain of evidence of international law and precedents to get to that point, that is immensely helpful. It's an issue of the willingness that is lacking.
Thank you, Mohammed. Issa, there is a direct question for you from the audience, so let me just read this to you. So this question is the following. It was mentioned that a French activist was deported after documenting human rights violations in the West Bank. Aysenu Agi, an American activist, was tragically killed last year. Daniel Santiago was shot in the leg. What is the current status of international solidarity programs like the International Solidarity Movement and FAST 3A? Can you speak to that maybe?
The Israeli government and the Israeli military, they try to disconnect the Palestinians from the international community and from international human rights organizations, and they try to isolate us and shut off our voices, and they see any international who comes to help the Palestinians on the ground as an enemy. So they target them, they shoot them, they kill them, they detain them, they blacklist them. So they are going after anyone who tries to come and be a neutral witness of what's going on the ground, because they want their narrative to be the only narrative in the West. This is a strategy since very long time. 10 days ago, they detained Luisa Morgantini, a former EU parliamentarian, and Francesca Albanese, the UN human rights reporters for Palestine, is blacklisted and she's not allowed to come to Palestine. There are many other human rights organizations, many other human rights investigators, journalists. There is a censorship on everything in Israel. They don't want anybody to come. In spite of all of that, all that restriction and censorship, isolation, and disconnection of Palestinians, and they don't want any neutral investigation on Gaza. Even they didn't want internal investigation about October 7th. The Israeli Knesset refused an internal Israeli investigation about what happened on October 7th. It means a lot to me and to many other human rights experts, because they want to hide the truth. They don't want the truth to be the narrative, and they don't want the Palestinian voice to be outside. 2019, Israeli settlers started a campaign against TIPH in Hebron, the international neutral observers who came after the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, and Netanyahu dismissed them from Hebron. It was led by Norway and other 5 countries, and nobody talked about that. The TIPH mission in Hebron from 1995 to 2019 documented more than 40,000 incidents against Palestinians. 40,000 incidents in almost a few years. You know, what is 1995 to 2019? It means there are war crimes happening in West Bank and in Gaza and in East Jerusalem. There is apartheid, there is a genocide, ethnic cleansing, and Israel, again, is not defending itself. Israel is working to expand its borders to Syria now and to Lebanon, as Aseel said. And in the ground, we face, ethnic cleansing, we face a transfer. So the activists and journalists and the international people from Western countries who come to Palestine, they became a target. But we have many activists who managed to reach and work with Palestinians to escort kids to school. This is what they do. They escort the kids to go to their schools. They escort the farmers to go to their villages. They help families to get water, to get electricity in West Bank. In Gaza, it's blocked completely, but nowadays we have volunteers, and anybody wants to come. We have our own tactics to bring them in and to engage them in our nonviolence, resistance, and peaceful approach to make peace. We are the Palestinians. We're spending a lot of energy and we work very hard to make peace with the Israelis. On the other hand, we don't have any Israeli partners. We don't have any Israeli political party who sees politically, peace with Palestinians part of their agenda. It's only the joint list, the Arab joint list with Hadash. That's the only group who, in the Israeli Knesset, who talk about peace, who's rejecting peace, who's rejecting ending the occupation and ending the apartheid, are the Israelis and their American administration official supporters. And something very important, this is very important and crucial. Israel would not be able to maintain the occupation for that long without the international blind support from the US, from UK, from EU, and from many other countries. So there are many countries officially contributing to my suffering. They contributed to Aseel leaving her house, to Muhammad to leave his house, to what is happening in Palestine. There are many contributors from the West, and there are a lot even investing in Israeli settlement, and it's against the international law. They invest money, they invest technology, they invest research, and the academic intellectuals, they come to Israeli settlements, which was described by the international law, especially Geneva Convention Article 49, as a war crime. And recently, the International Court of Justice, ruled that the occupation is illegal and any relationship with the Israeli settlements are illegal. But in my house here in Tal Rumeda, in Hebron, I see many American groups here. They come to help the Israeli settlers. They come to help the Israeli settlements. The main charity organization, the main American charity organization, which supports the Israeli settlers in Hebron, it's called Hebron Fund, and it's based in New York. And there are many other NGOs all over the world. They contribute to Israeli fanatic extremist settlers to being stronger. Even they contribute to them weapons, they contribute to them surveillance as drones and cameras to go after us and to intimidate us and to violate our privacy as Palestinians.
Since we're coming to the end of the hour, let me just formulate a couple of questions and then call on Aseel and Muhammad to answer either one of those. So one question here that, of course, would be on lots of people's minds. Is there actually anything right now that gives you hope? What gives you hope? How do you envisage a future that could come out of this hope? And so that's one question to speak to. And another question, maybe slightly more concrete, what international policy shift specifically would make the biggest difference for Palestinian lives on the ground now? Maybe turning to Aseel first and then to Muhammad.
Okay, the strongest thing that gives me hope is the resilience of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Even though they struggled for 16 months, but they show steadfastness, as we say sumud in Arabic. They are trying to survive even after the genocide, even when they have no homes, when they have no necessities for life. And maybe internationally, the support of the activists around the world and the awareness of the Palestinian cause after the 7th of October gives me hope that one day Palestine will be free. And the work of the journalists in Gaza and their strength in covering the news and telling the truth to the whole world also gives me hope that we will never surrender our land until our land's free. Thank
Muhammad.
you.
Thanks. I would say one of the things that give me hope, although it's near impossible to have any at the moment where things are so bleak and despaired, but one of the things is our shared, I would say first the Arabic word khalas means enough. And that is a sentiment that is seen in Gaza and in Israel as well. People are saying, khalas, enough, we don't want this anymore. We cannot live with this anymore. And if this is utilized with our shared and intimate first-hand personal experience of pain, loss, and disposition as Palestinians and as Jewish people, we both have a very intimate experience with this. Jews have been on the receiving end of terrorism and persecution for centuries, culminating with the Holocaust. That experience, that pain, that trauma can be used to work to prevent it from happening to anybody else. One of the things that I've been trying to use since the start of the war to prevent myself from falling into a tribalist nature or dehumanizing people or this sort of chest beating rage and hatred is basically I have two videos on my desktop on the computer. One is a Palestinian child from Gaza who's being asked, "Where is your mother? Where is your mother?" And he cannot articulate a single word, but his eyes are saying it all. And the other is an Israeli child on the grave, I think, of his uncle, if I believe correctly. And he's putting Pokemon cards on it and trying to speak to his uncle and saying, he can hear me, he can hear me. And my strongest motivation is to prevent that from happening to anybody else. I lost my father at a very early age when I was a child because of the blockade, because of the siege. In that war, I kept counting how many friends and family and colleagues I've lost. One of my closest friends, Ali Adam, he was killed in January last year. And the most painful thing about it is that he died before he ever experienced living. His worst day of the year was basically his birthday. It reminded him that he is growing older, his life is wasting before his eyes, and he never got a chance to live it. His biggest dream was just to experience a day of normal, dignified life. He was a man of huge potential. He would have been extremely delighted to speak. He deserved to speak here today, and instead of me, he was a brilliant man. He was my moral compass, and he was killed without a past, present, or future. What made it the most devastating episode in that entire war is that I basically have no one to mourn him with. He never got a chance to be known. There's also the other thing about international mechanisms, to say it very briefly. I would say that there is now a very extremely generous offer on the table. Complete Arab-Israeli normalization. Also normalization between Israel and Muslim countries. It doesn't get more generous than this. Israel would be fully integrated into the region in return for a two-state solution. Everyone should work towards this before we lose that opportunity. And working towards it means both in terms of incentives and punitive measures. Whichever party decides not to engage with this should be penalized for refusing peace, for causing more death and hatred to be sustained.
Thank you, Mohammed. So thank you all. We have, your voices are very powerful. We have heard a lot about how the three of you see the situation, what prospects for the future you see. It is obvious the sincerity with which you approach also the prospects for peace for the future here. This is obvious, and of course we have also simply learned in passing a whole lot about the enormous pain in your own background. And so personally, I want to say I know it takes an enormous amount of courage to do this kind of work, to keep going in this line of work with all the pain and suffering, often death and destruction that you see around you. So I do thank you for being in this webinar with us. Your voices are incredibly important, and we are eager to play a role in making sure your voices are heard in this discussion. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for the audience for hearing these voices and for working with what they have said, so that we can all have a larger conversation that is actually focused towards creating a lasting peace here rather than just managing a conflict. Thank you very much.